say Tommy gun. And many people immediately see a movie scene, gangsters in fedoras, long coats, a Chicago typewriter chattering in black and white. For the men who carried the Thompson in World War II, it was something very different. For a Marine on a jungle trail on Guadalcanal, the Thompson was 10.5 pounds of wood and steel that felt either like a lifeline or like a burden, depending on how far he had to march that day. For a ranger on a windswept cliff above the Channel coast of France, it was the weapon he trusted at arm's length when the enemy was on the other side of a hedgerow or a bunker door. The gangster legend came from the cities. The real reputation came from places most Americans had never heard of: bloody ridges in the Pacific, apple orchards behind invasion beaches, and frozen hills in Korea. In this episode, we're going to follow how a weapon designed as a trench broom became a specialist tool in a rifleman's war, what it was actually like to carry and fire, and how the soldiers and Marines who used it remembered the Thompson, not as a toy, but as a very serious friend at very short range. Chapter 1. From Gangster Gun to GI Tool. The idea began before World War I was even over. John Taliaferro Thompson, a retired United States Army Ordnance officer, wanted a weapon that could sweep a trench clean. A compact automatic gun, chambered for the heavy .45 ACP pistol round, firing so quickly that a squad could clear a dugout before the enemy had time to react. By the time prototypes were ready, the armistice had already been signed. The war ended. The trench broom had missed its war. In the 1920s, the first commercial Thompsons went on sale. They were beautifully made. Cooling fins on the barrel, a polished finish, drum magazines that looked as if they belonged in a silent film. They were also painfully expensive. A single gun could cost around $200, more than many Americans made in a month. Police departments bought some. So did a few Marines and small foreign armies. But the customers who gave the Thompson its early fame were not soldiers at all. They were bootleggers, bodyguards, and organized crime gangs. Newspapers christened it the Chicago typewriter. The St. Valentine's Day massacre burned the silhouette of the Thompson into public memory. For many Americans, it became the symbol of Prohibition-era violence. Inside the Army, opinions were mixed. Some officers liked the idea of a compact automatic weapon. Others saw only headlines and gangsters, and doubted that such a heavy, complex gun could have a place in a modern field army. Then the world changed again. By the late 1930s, Europe was preparing for another war. Britain, suddenly alone after Dunkirk, needed automatic weapons urgently. Factories in the United States began turning out M1928, A1 Thompsons for British contracts and for American Marines. When the United States entered the war, the Thompson was ready. But it was never intended to replace the rifle. It was too heavy, too expensive, and too short range to arm every infantryman. Instead, it was issued as a specialist weapon. Company and platoon leaders, squad sergeants, scouts on night patrol, paratroopers jumping into occupied Europe, rangers climbing cliffs, tank commanders and drivers, British and Commonwealth commandos on raids along hostile coasts. In a typical American rifle company, dozens of men carried M1 Garand rifles. Perhaps a handful would have Thompsons. The rifle remained the backbone. The Tommy gun was the close-quarters hammer you handed to the people who expected to walk into trouble first. Chapter 2. What kind of weapon was the Thompson? On paper, the wartime Thompson was simple to describe. A submachine gun chambered for the .45 ACP cartridge, a stubby 10.5-inch barrel, a wooden stock, a box magazine holding 20, and later 30 rounds. In reality, it was a family of guns that evolved under pressure. The early M1928A1 kept much of John Thompson's original design. a complicated blish lock that slowed the bolt, a finely machined rear sight, a cuts compensator at the muzzle, and the ability to use those famous drum magazines. It was beautifully made and slow and expensive to produce. By 1942, the United States needed something that could be manufactured quickly. The M1 and then the M1A1. Thompson simplified the design. No blish lock, no cooling fins, no drum magazines, a straight blowback system, a fixed firing pin, and simple box magazines only. To the men on the line, what mattered was this: the gun still fired the same heavy .45 caliber round. It still spat out bullets at roughly 600 to 700 rounds per minute. And it still weighed around 10 3/4 pounds with a loaded box magazine in place. If you imagine picking one up, you have to start with the weight. The Thompson is no lightweight carbine. It is a dense steel and wood object that feels closer to a small machine gun than to a pistol. Veterans and modern shooters alike say almost the same thing when they handle one for the first time. It is heavier than it looks, but it sits very still in your hands. On the range, that weight had a purpose. The .45 ACP round travels slower than rifle bullets, but it hits hard at close range. In single shots, a Thompson can be surprisingly precise, especially with the older Lyman rear sight. In short bursts, the weight of the gun soaks up much of the recoil. The muzzle climbs, but not so violently that a trained shooter loses control. At 20 to 50 yards, a disciplined gunner can keep a string of 3 or 4 rounds inside the width of a doorway. That is exactly the kind of accuracy you need in a jungle thicket or the hallway of a stone house. Of course, everything has a price. That same weight becomes punishment on a long march. 10.5 pounds for the gun. More pounds for magazines and ammunition, on top of a pack, water, grenades, and everything else a soldier carries. In the mud of New Guinea or the heat of Italy, some troops quietly envied the riflemen with lighter weapons and lighter loads. Maintenance also mattered. The older M1928A1 could be finicky if it was not kept clean and oiled. The simplified M1A1 was more forgiving, but sand, dust, and jungle mud still found their way into the action. In most after-action reports, the verdict is steady and sober. If you treated the Thompson like serious equipment, cleaned it, kept the magazines in good shape, and learned to fire in controlled bursts, it repaid you with reliability and frightening close-range firepower. If you neglected it or tried to hose down a whole hillside on full automatic, it would run out of ammunition quickly and sometimes let you down. Chapter 3: Marines, Rangers, and the Close-Range War. Imagine a Marine patrol moving through jungle on Guadalcanal in 1942. The sun is gone, it is raining, the trail is more mud than earth. Out in front, a sergeant carries a Thompson. Behind him, riflemen spread out with their Garands. Everyone is straining to hear something other than insects and dripping leaves. When contact comes, it is at 20 or 30 yards, and it is sudden. A shout in Japanese, a flash among the trees, the flat crack of enemy rifles. The sergeant's world shrinks to the weight of the gun in his hands. He slams the selector to automatic, leans into the stock, and empties a short burst into the shadows. In that instant, the Thompson is doing exactly what John Thompson dreamed it would do, throwing a wall of heavy bullets into a narrow space so quickly that the enemy never gets a second chance. Reports from Marine commanders on Guadalcanal and later campaigns often praise the submachine gun for jungle fighting. At 20 yards in tall grass or bamboo, a rifle's long-range accuracy is wasted. What matters is who can put the first decisive burst of fire into a dark patch of foliage. In that environment, the Thompson's weight, recoil, and slow bullet became advantages. It stayed controllable. It hit hard. And the sound of it, That harsh, chopping rhythm had an effect on morale that no statistic can measure. On the other side of the world, the same gun was being used very differently. June 6, 1944. The French coast. Off the beaches at a place called Pointe du Hoc, the 2nd Ranger Battalion is climbing a sheer cliff under fire. Among them is First Sergeant Leonard Bud Lomel. Like many Ranger leaders, he carries an M1A1 Thompson. By the time the Rangers reach the top, the guns they came to destroy have been moved. Lomel and another sergeant find the real battery hidden in an apple orchard inland. They have no time. German crews could return at any moment. They smash elevation and traverse mechanisms with thermite grenades. And when that is not enough, Lomel uses the butt of his Thompson as a hammer, pounding the sights and fittings until the big guns are blind and useless. For most of that day, the Thompson is both weapon and tool, used in close quarters firefights and as a chunk of steel that can batter iron into scrap. By nightfall, the Rangers have lost more than half their men. The guns they came to silence never fire on the beaches below. Farther inland, paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions are fighting in the thick hedgerows of western France. Many officers and squad leaders have jumped with Thompsons. In the tangled lanes between the fields, visibility is often less than 50 yards. A German patrol can appear from behind a bank of earth and brush almost without warning. In those conditions, riflemen with Garands lay down steady-aimed fire, while the Thompson gunners provide the shock. Short, savage bursts to break an ambush or to cover the last few yards into a farmyard or a barn. Some paratroopers later complained about the weight of the gun and the amount of ammunition it consumed. Others, remembering the first chaotic hours after the jump, said simply that they were glad to have something in their hands that spoke loudly at close range. Not every veteran loved the Thompson. Australian troops in New Guinea and Burma, wading through knee-deep mud, often preferred their own Owen gun. Simpler, easier to strip, and a little less fussy about dirt. American logistics officers looked at the cost per gun and the time each one took to machine, and pushed hard for its replacement by the cheaper M3 grease gun. But even the critics tended to agree on one point. If you were walking point on a night patrol, or kicking in a door, or fighting inside a tangle of hedgerows, you did not complain about the extra pounds on your shoulder. You wrapped your hands around the Thompson's grip, checked that a round was in the chamber, and were quietly thankful that, for the next few minutes at least, you had a machine gun's voice in a weapon you could carry and aim by yourself. Chapter 4. From Tool to Symbol. When the war ended, the Thompson story did not stop. Surplus guns stayed in armories. Some went to police departments. Others were shipped abroad to allies and new governments. In Korea, United Nations troops were startled to face Chinese and North Korean soldiers armed with captured Thompsons. The same hard-hitting bursts that had echoed in Pacific jungles were now heard on frozen ridgelines. By the early 1950s, though, the design was fading from frontline service. Lighter carbines, simpler submachine guns, and eventually assault rifles took over its role. The Thompson moved into a different life. Some were sold as surplus to American civilians who discovered that the old gangster gun was also a surprisingly friendly range companion, accurate in semi-automatic, soft recoiling, and built like a small engine block. Collectors began to hunt for pre-war commercial models and early military variants. Museums placed Thompsons behind glass next to uniforms and medals. On film and television, the split image solidified. In crime dramas and noir movies, it was still the weapon of mobsters. In World War II films and miniseries, it became part of the visual shorthand for the American soldier. A ranger, a paratrooper, a marine in a battered helmet, with a short, heavy gun in his hands. Video games later turned it into a selectable loadout, sometimes exaggerating its recoil or its mythical ability to mow down entire squads by itself. Real veterans tended to remember it more quietly. Some talked about how heavy it was. Some remembered the comfort of that big pistol round in the alleys of a ruined town or the undergrowth of a dark island. Modern shooters on collectors' ranges often describe the same feeling that when you shoulder a Thompson, you are not just firing an old machine, you are borrowing a tool that once stood between very young men in very bad situations at very short distances. In the end, the Thompson was never the main character of the Second World War. It did not win battles by itself. It did not replace the rifle. What it did was fill a narrow but vital space between the pistol and the machine gun. In patrols, in raids, on cliffs and jungle trails, whenever a few men had to bring a great deal of force to a very small piece of ground. For those who carried it, the memories are rarely about glamour. They remember the weight on their shoulder, the smell of oil and cordite, and the way a short burst at 30 yards could change the outcome of a night. The rest of us see a silhouette in old photographs and on movie posters, and we call it a legend. They saw it differently. To them, it was simply their Thompson, a hard, heavy tool that more than once helped them come home. Thank you for listening. See you next time.